What do we do when someone preaches violence against us? Do we use our freedom of speech to tell them they're wrong? Or do we take away their freedom of speech because they might use it to incite violence? Here at the Perception Loop, we like to think that being tolerant is always good, but the truth is more complicated than that. This is the tolerance paradox. We all want to live in tolerant societies that allow us to speak our minds and disagree with authority. But some ideologies are so intolerant, they threaten these very freedoms. How do we stop them from taking away what we ourselves value so much? And how much tolerance should we really be giving to intolerance? It's a big question. So let's unpack this tolerance paradox and see if we can find an answer. To understand where we are today, we first need to travel back to the Enlightenment, which began in the 17th century and gave rise to modern democracy. In Europe, thinkers like John Locke argued that government power comes from the people, and that the role of government is to protect the natural rights of its citizens, including the right to life, liberty, and property. But this new way of thinking about politics was not welcomed by all. In fact, there was one group in particular that felt very threatened by it, the ruling elite. These were the monarchies and aristocracies that had ruled Europe for centuries. They were used to having all the power and they didn't want to give it up. For example, in France, the king's absolute power was challenged by the writers of the Encyclopedia, who argued that the government should be limited by the law and accountable to the people. The ruling elite responded by banning the Encyclopedia and persecuting its writers. This conflict between the old ways of thinking and the new ways of thinking led to the French Revolution and then the Reign of Terror. During this time, thousands of people were guillotined simply for expressing their political opinions. That's why when Karl Popper published his essay, The Open Society and Its Enemies in 1945, he was acutely aware of what can happen when intolerance takes over a society. The book is an attack on totalitarianism and advocates for open societies that value freedom and democracy. Popper argues that the ideas of Plato and Hegel were dangerous because they advocated for a closed society. He feared that if we stopped questioning things, we would end up like the ancient Greeks who had taken a dull knife and sharpened it into the shape of a sword. In other words, we become willing to do anything to defend our beliefs. Popper claimed that we need to keep our minds open and be willing to listen to opposing viewpoints even if we don't agree with them. In his essay, Popper doesn't advocate for unlimited tolerance. Instead, he calls for a society that tolerates different opinions and beliefs while still holding people accountable for their actions. To illustrate this idea, Popper uses the example of a person who says, "I'm going to commit a crime." In this situation, Popper argues that we have a duty to prevent the crime from happening, even if it means infringing on the person's right to free speech. In other words, sometimes protecting society requires limiting individual freedom. But what does this mean in practice? How do we decide where to draw the line between tolerance and intolerance? For Popper, the answer lies in the intentions of the speaker. If someone says, "I'm going to commit a crime," it's not just empty words. It's a statement of intent that could lead to harm. Therefore, we can limit their free speech because it could cause damage. But what if instead they said, "Crime is wrong"? In this case, although we might disagree with them, their statement isn't intended to cause harm, so we should allow them to say it. In essence, Popper argues that we should only tolerate those who tolerate others, but we should not tolerate those who are intolerant. This seems straightforward enough, but in practice it's far from easy. When it comes to stopping hateful speech, we need to ask ourselves, are they advocating for violence, or are they simply expressing an opinion? Are they inciting others to break the law, or are they merely criticizing the government? In many cases, the line between tolerance and intolerance is blurry, and the answers aren't obvious. However, we must be cautious when dealing with intolerant ideologies. In his essay, Popper highlights the dangers of totalitarian ideologies like Marxism and fascism. He warns that these ideologies seek to control every aspect of our lives, and that they use violence and oppression to silence dissent. According to Popper, we should not tolerate those who seek to undermine the values of an open society, because once they gain power, they will take away the very freedoms that make it possible for us to disagree with them. It's important to remember that protecting open societies requires constant vigilance. Just because we disagree with someone doesn't mean we should silence them. But when their ideas threaten the fabric of society, we must be prepared to take action. This is the tension inherent in creating a tolerant society. We must balance the need for individual freedom with the need for social order and justice. And unfortunately, this tension has only become more apparent in recent times. Today, we live in a world that feels increasingly divided. People are often quick to label anyone who disagrees with them as an enemy. Online platforms have become echo chambers where people are only exposed to information that confirms their existing biases. And this has led to a surge in polarization and extremism. When faced with this polarization, many have called for a return to the free exchange of ideas. They argue that by shutting down debate and censoring speech, we only give in to the very forces that are tearing our societies apart. In this context, some believe that Popper's ideas offer a valuable perspective. By focusing on the intentions of speakers rather than the content of their speech, we can avoid silencing legitimate dissent while still protecting society from those who seek to do harm. However, others argue that this approach is too simplistic and fails to take into account the real-world consequences of speech. They point to the rise of hate speech and online harassment as evidence that social media companies need to do more to moderate harmful content and protect vulnerable groups. So how should we navigate this complex issue? The answer, as with many things, probably lies somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, we must be cautious of the dangers of totalitarianism and the importance of protecting our hard-won freedoms. On the other hand, we must also recognize the value of free speech and the need to protect vulnerable groups from hate speech and harassment. Perhaps the key to finding the right balance lies in education. If we teach people to be critical thinkers who can evaluate evidence and arguments, we will be better equipped to deal with the challenges of living in a polarized world. We must teach people to recognize the difference between constructive criticism and harmful rhetoric, and we must encourage them to engage in civil discourse and debate. Ultimately, the tolerance paradox reminds us that tolerance is not a virtue that we should blindly follow. Instead, it's a tool that we can use to create a better world. When used wisely, tolerance can help us build bridges of understanding and create a more tolerant and compassionate society. But when taken to extremes, it can enable those who seek to tear down the very freedoms that make it possible for us to disagree with them. It's up to us to find the right balance between these two extremes. Have you ever struggled with deciding how much tolerance is too much? Share your thoughts below, and be sure to subscribe to The Perception Loop for more thought-provoking videos.